Tonight we're going to turn to the book of Judges in chapter 7. Let's start at verse 2 in the book of Judges, chapter 7, verse 2, and read together through verse 8. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand has saved me. Now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned to the people 20 and 2,000, and there remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down under the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So he brought down the people under the water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself, likewise every one that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go every man unto his place. So the people took victuals in their hand and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man unto his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. Gideon's life and his story is a lesson of service. When we see Gideon, and we see that he was a prophet of God, of course, but also we learn that he was a very special man in many ways. When we see him and we read about him, to read about him naturally moves us to ask, okay, if Gideon could do all this with 300, what can I do? Society has a standard of success. Oftentimes it's included with degrees from different schools and different kinds of training and testing of this kind and that kind and proving themselves in a certain way. Oftentimes it's a matter of making simple connections that make a difference as to whether we're success in our society or not. But success with God comes in a different form, a different fashion. It has nothing to do with schools of higher learning. It doesn't even necessarily have to do with experience, because God gives us what I would define on-the-job training. Our success simply comes by being willing to sit at the feet of the master teacher. If we'll sit at the feet of Jesus, we can be successful and always be victorious. Because God teaches us the ways that work. Every way that we try in and of ourselves will always fail. Israel was the same way. Had God allowed Israel to have gone after their enemies with a great army, Israel would have certainly thought that they themselves had been responsible for their victory. God wanted them to understand that success lay not in their own hands, but in the hands of God himself, as he directed their path and guided and guarded them as an army. Gideon was a winner simply because he chose to obey God's will. The book of Judges is the book of history. What it does, it takes up where Joshua's conquest had left off. The most successful military leader of all time prior to David was Joshua. Moses had taken the children of Israel to the promised land on 2 occasions. But they failed to go in. The second time they failed to go in because of Moses' unbelief, or not unbelief necessarily, but his failure to sanction God in the eyes of the people. Moses was forbidden to enter the promised land. But the children of Israel were destined, they were doomed because of their doubt, to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until that generation of doubters died off. And it was Joshua who rose up as a great leader. Moses had delivered them to the border twice, 40 years apart, 2 generations, but one was unprepared and the other was ready. Moses was 80 years preparing to lead God's people. Joshua was 40 years by his side, making him ready as a leader. And the conquest of Canaan was a world-renowned military victory. It was a demonstration of God's greatness as we look upon an humble nation of people who had been slaves in Egypt. Once slaves, now mighty men of valor. Being only followers of the rule of the law of the land, doing everything the Egyptians forced upon them, to now being filled with the kind of leadership that will make them be victorious. Joshua's book is a book of victory. Think about what was done under Joshua's leadership. Nations were conquered. They were able to subdue the land that God had promised to them, and their land was divided amongst them as God had promised to those tribes. The tribes were able to settle in and enjoy the fruits of the harvest of the promise that God had made. The covenant had been renewed, and the promises had been renewed, and the warnings had been renewed. They had been warned over and over again. They had to continue to subside with God if they were going to be successful. But Joshua has gone his way now. And the land has gone through a transition. And so we see the book of Judges, and we see it as being a different kind of book. When you begin to read it, you'll notice that mostly the book of Judges is a book of defeat. Under Joshua, Israel had settled the land of promise. Under Joshua, they had been successful. But they had enjoyed prosperity, but they had failed to remember what God told them. They didn't drive all the inhabitants out of the land. So they are a nation that has forgotten God. And every man, the book says, in the book of Judges said, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Twice that's mentioned. I believe, might be 3 times, but I know it's twice. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. What that means is they were not looking to God for their governance. They were doing what they thought best. That's what we do best. Oftentimes, when we find ourselves in a situation, instead of turning to God, we do that which is right in our own eyes, and then when it doesn't work out, we wonder what happened. When in reality, if we'd have followed God's instruction and God's guidance all along, we'd have been successful. But when we fail to forget God, or to remember God, and their failure was that they forgot God, they failed to drive the people out of the land. Then when they left them there, they began to intermarry with those people who did not believe in God, and they were led away. They drifted into idolatry, and they were oppressed by their enemies. The story of Gideon, as you read up to it in the book of Judges, you'll find that they're being oppressed by the Midianites. And so now these people who enjoyed this freedom after being delivered to the promised land, enjoyed this freedom under Joshua's reign, are now finding themselves once again in bondage. And fear is throughout the land, and poverty. And it brought them into a place of humility, and they cried unto the Lord, Judges 6 and verse 6. And God hears their call. And God raises up a Gideon. Gideon is called by God. And it's a time that's very crucial because it's a time when the people need a leader. We always need to provide good leadership. But sometimes leadership is more critical than other times. When we have a lot of people who are standing and doing that which is right, we need leaders, but not as much as we might find ourselves needing good leaders when people are on their lowest ebb. That's when we've got to step up. We've got to recognize it's time for me to take charge. It's time for you to take charge. And leadership comes in different places. It can be the very young who lead. It can be those that are more mature and a little older who lead. It can be those that are middle-aged. It certainly can be those that are elderly or older who are going to lead and set the proper example. But each and every one of us, in our own way, can be a leader in and of ourselves. We don't have to lead a great multitude to be a leader. You might be the leader of 1 or 2. You might be the one that sets the example for just one other person. And the two of you together then begin to make an example for another person and another person. And it continues to build and build and build and build. But what we have to know is that it doesn't matter how the rest of the world is going. We've got to be the kind of people that God needs us to be, and we've got to lead. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Might does not make right. Neither does a vast majority in God's world mean that we are right. The world in Noah's day was as wicked as it ever could have been, and God repented that He made man. He's going to destroy the whole world. I was looking at the ark when we were up there in Kentucky here the other day, and they were estimating the population of the ark. Just estimates, and these were all just estimates. They don't know all these things for a certainty. But according to their calculations, it's very possible that the world had a greater population than it does even today. Think about that. And with a population even greater than it is today, and 8 souls were saved by water, and Noah, out of billions of people, found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Were it not for Noah and his faith, we wouldn't exist today. The world would have ceased a long time ago. But God is a God of mercy, the God of grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Gideon is chosen. Gideon calls for a sign. As we read in the previous chapters, cakes and flesh are prepared, a sign is given. And after God convinces him that he is the man, why did he need a sign? Because he was humble, meek. He wasn't certain he was qualified for the job, just like Moses. After the sign is given, he builds an altar to God, and he takes his own servants, and he goes and he breaks down the altars of Baal with the help of these servants, and he takes them away from the presence of the people. And when this takes place, the Midianites assemble an army. But once again, Gideon is assured by a sign, the fleece and the dew. And God gives him this sign. And now he calls for volunteers. According to the text there, he chooses, or has rather, 32,000 gathered to volunteer. But God says, no, I want you to whittle that down a little bit. They're going against the Midianite army of 150,000 men, but God says, no. You're going to bring that down a little bit. So he says, go tell them, anybody that's fearful. If they're not willing, then let those that are not brave depart. And they are down now to 10,000 men. And God still says that's too many. 22,000 leave, 10,000 remain. The courageous remain, but God says, no, that's too many. We oftentimes won't encounter something and face it the way we should because we're afraid. We're afraid there's not enough. We're afraid that our foes are too many. And yet God says, no, 10,000 is too many. 10,000 against 150,000 is absolutely too many. I want you to bring it down some more. And so we have this test, this water test, and we see this test here in chapter 7 where God chooses 300 men to go against this army. 300 are chosen out of an original 32,000. All because God wants us to understand this is written for us. They've already lived it. It's already come to pass. It's already done. They saw the victory. God has written this and preserved this for us because God wants us to see where the victory always comes from. This drinking was just a test. It was the final test. And those that lap water, putting it in their hand or their mouth is what remains. And the result is the remaining is 300. And this is God's army. I was reading something about this when I prepared this lesson a few years ago. I remember working on it and reading where some guy said, well, the reason that they did that was this would be somebody who was watchful. And this would be the best soldiers because they drink looking around. I don't need that. Thank you so much. How would you know? They supposed it might be that way. God just picked them because He picked them. We can suppose all we want. It doesn't matter how brave they are, Grant, there's still just 300 of them going against 150,000. God chose them, and that's enough. Here's what we need to understand, that God is sifting out even now. I want you to think about that. That's a done deal. That's taken place. The good news is that God picked the right 300. The good news is that God gave them the victory. The good news is that Gideon was a leader that was recognized throughout Israel, and he died in his old age, being a servant of God, an humble man of God, who served God and served the people. That's then. This is now. God has very clear tests that determine quality. We're interested in numbers. Naturally so, because we're uplifted by numbers. And we should be concerned about numbers. But God is interested in quality. He's looking for those who have a willingness, a desire to stand with Him. God is looking for those with courage, not reckless abandon, not foolishness, not silliness, but He wants those with strength of heart to be willing to endure every hardship that comes our way, and are willing to go however far it takes to be everything that God desires that we be. Jesus said, many are called, few are chosen, some simply will not make it. Not because they can't, but because they choose not to. Those that make it are those that continue to trust in God. Those that make it are those who are willing to recognize His way is best and right in the long run in everything that we do. Everything. If we'll follow God and trust Him implicitly in the things that we do, we'll be like Gideon, we'll always be successful. These traits are to be built. We have to learn to grow, and we have to learn to mature. We can't be faint of heart. We can't be fickle. We can't be on one side of the line today and we're on fire today, tomorrow we're cold, today we're hot, tomorrow we're cold. Jesus talked about those of Laodicea who were lukewarm. And He said, I'd rather you be the cold or hot. If you're lukewarm, I'll do what? He said, I'll spew thee out of my mouth. Because those that are lukewarm have a pretense of being where they need to be. They put on a good show, but they cannot be counted on. They cannot be depended on. God picked those 300 men to do that job that needed to be done, and He can use us even when we often consider ourselves to be weak. God wants to use you, and God wants to use me. But I've got to be willing to be used. I've got to be willing to be used up. I've mentioned many times over the years, if you go back and you look at all these characters in the Bible, you notice exactly the same thing about every one of them. Everyone that God chose was exactly the same. They were individuals of like passions as we are. That means they were like me. That means they were like you. They had their strengths. They had their weaknesses. They had their securities. They had their insecurities. They had their shortcomings. And yet God was able to use every one of them as long as they continued to endure. But we also notice that with each one, at the end of their life, it comes to the same conclusion. Once they have reached the end, it says, and they died. They died being used up in God's service. Gideon died being used up in God's service. His faithful servant. I've got to be willing to be used up. But in order to be used up, I've got to learn and I've got to apply. I've got to put myself to the test. I've got to work out my own salvation with fear and trembling. I've got to lay aside every weight and the sin which just so easily beset me. and run with patience the race that is set before me, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of my faith. I've got to endure to the end. I've got to be faithful even unto death, and He will give me the crown of life. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 21 through 27, for after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. You and I can make a difference. But we've got to want to make a difference. We can make a difference when we invite folks to come. We can make a difference when we invite folks to study. We can make a difference when we allow ourselves to be a consistent pattern day in and day out of what it means to be a Christian. When was the last time you were excited about the work? When was the last time you were serious about the work? I'm talking about like you get excited about other things. We all get excited about ball games. We all get excited about fishing trips. We all get excited about going hunting. That's what men do. I don't know what ladies get excited about. I'm sorry, I never have explored my feminine side. But we all have things of the world that excite us. Why not get just as excited over the things of God? In fact, even more so, because we're talking about the things that pertain to my eternal salvation. Why not get excited about a place called heaven? I promise you, if there was a bus pulled up out front and it was taking folks to heaven, you wouldn't be able to get a seat because the thing would be packed so full they'd be lined up as far as they could go to get on board. But there is going to be no bus. I've got to make up my mind right here and right now, tonight and tomorrow and the next day, if I want to go to heaven. And I've got to make certain that I'm already on board. I've got to make sure that my name is written in heaven. And I can't scribble it in myself. I can't pencil it in myself. Sometimes when you're playing ball and you have a substitute, you have to pencil them in, don't you? You have to scratch one out and pencil one in because they didn't make it. God's doing the right. And He'll add us or He'll take us away. But guess what? I get to make that choice of whether or not He adds me by choosing Him. Because if I choose Him, He's going to choose me. I remember in school, we used to play different kind of games. We'd play Red Rover. I don't guess they play Red Rover anymore, do they? Where you lock your arms and they got to run through and they got to break through to get to the other side. That's too dangerous. We can't play that anymore. We used to play pinball. Pinball. Did you ever play pinball in the gym? Where you line the volleyballs up at half court and everybody breaks and runs from one end to the other, and you grab a volleyball and you try to take somebody out with it. Hey, buddy, if you knew how to throw that thing, they'll run and you hit them in the back. Oh. There'd be a big mark on their back, big red mark. They didn't cry, they just had to get out. And you had to guard the bowling pin. There was 2 pins set up, and they were throwing, and they were trying to take that thing out. And you're sitting there guarding it. You could either catch it, or you could get another ball and you could block it. That's too dangerous. We can't play that anymore. Now, my whole point of that was, if you were the runt, you got picked last. That was the walk of shame. The walk of shame. I mean, there's girls out there, Grant, and they're picking, and you're standing over and you're the last one called because they called a girl before they called you. That's a walk of shame, son. But what that does, it makes you get tough. Because you don't want to walk the walk of shame. You want your buddy beside you to be the last one to be called. But God will choose me if I choose Him. We got to make our minds up. God can use us if I will be used. Because He makes even the weakest strong. And strength in God's army is not measured by quantity, but it's measured by quality. He measured by how they drank water in Gideon's day. But today, His standard of measure is very simple. It's the gospel. And He measures us by what we are willing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Whether or not I'm willing to be faithful. Whether or not I'm willing to be obedient to His will. And whether or not I'm willing to always stay strong and set the kind of example that those around me need. And encourage them to go to a place called heaven along with me. But for the record, Gideon's army was victorious. What do you know? 2 months ago? Was it 2 months ago? I let y'all out of here early. Where's Anna? She wasn't here either time. Bless her heart. Somebody call her and tell her. Think about it. Enough said. Why don't you do what you need to do tonight? God's choosing. God's picking. Why don't you be in the Lord's army? We invite you to come while together we stand and we sing through encouragement.